Welcome to SchezzWho, Hampton Road's top spot for politics. Tonight's show will feature Maat, the Libertarian Party ticket's vice presidential candidate. Shout out to SchezzWho's first guest, Chase Oliver, who is now the presidential candidate for the Libertarian candidacy in 2024. Great to have Mike on and get a full sense of the full ticket. Can't forget to shout out Andrea, my lovely wife, who created this channel and the one who makes me happiest. Go right ahead. I'm going to make sure to put her right there, straight from the wedding day. Makes me happiest. Again, she created this channel. So happy to have her helping me through all this. I also want to shout out my good friend, Miss Ellen, over at Ellen's Homestyle and Barbecue Express, with the one great location in Portsmouth, Virginia, at Portsmouth Boulevard. And of course, University Shops across from Regent University in Virginia Beach. She has great fried fish. That's my favorite item from her. So just make sure you look up for Miss Ellen's Homestyle and Barbecue Express. Also want to shout out my good friend, Mr. Seiko Varner, who helped put me into podcasting back in the day in 2020. And his company, Positive Vibes Incorporated, does entertainment and consulting services. We do credit fixes, we do tax resolutions, we lend private money, we do debt consolidation. So hit him up at positivevibesfinancial@gmail.com or 757-932-0177 to make sure you get his assistance for all of that. Alrighty, now let's bring on tonight's guest. He's Mike Maat, running on the National Libertarian ticket for U.S. President. How you doing, sir?
Good. Thank you for having me on tonight. It's a pleasure to be with you. And how good does Ellen's look, by the way? I'm missing that fried fish special.
It's excellent. My go-to is her catfish, but whiting I had a couple Sundays back is also really good. Her macaroni cheese is awesome. I would imagine that having her food while listening to politics is one of the great joys of being here in Tidewater.
That would be good, even without the politics. I'm a couple hours north of Portsmouth, but next time I'm there, I know where I'm going for fried fish. That's absolutely
you make a nice little campaign trip on down to Hampton Roads.
Good call. I'll have to speak to the campaign about that.
Now, tonight, I'm glad to have you on because we're going to discuss some great national topics. But I want to bring on my friends here who know politics themselves. Melissa Luxon in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and Akia Miller out of Hampton, Virginia. So we get a nice 757 representation tonight. I want to lead off the questioning, if I could. If you could break down yourself, your history, your education, just what gets your mind going in terms of politics.
I appreciate that. I grew up in financial services. I was a banker for a number of years. After getting out of engineering school, I worked for a couple of banks in and around New York in commercial finance. Went back to graduate school to study economics. I was in Washington, D.C. I had gone to the George Washington University, which was a very pro-market, sort of a descendant of the Chicago school type of graduate school programs that put me in good stead. I spent a couple of years working for the White House as an economist, spent a couple of years working with other agencies, spent almost a decade advocating in Washington for free markets, for a deregulated environment, for greater competition in financial services. Spent quite a few years running my own business after that. We had our own business in strategic consulting and executive education for financial services professionals. I've taught economics at 3 different universities. As a second career, I worked as a police officer for 11 and a half years in South Broward County, Florida. I lived in Florida for almost 20 years. Worked as a police officer from age 49 to 60, which is to say until just a couple of years ago. So I spend a lot of time talking about economics, but I also spend a lot of time talking about important changes that I believe that we need to make to our criminal justice system, changes that I believe that we need to make in terms of how we hold police officers accountable, restructuring that industry. So a lot of different aspects of libertarianism I spend a lot of time focusing on.
All right. Now, do I understand that you have run before?
I have run for Congress before, yes, a couple years ago in Broward County, Florida, in D20 for an election that was a special election when Congressman Alcee Hastings had passed away.
And I think Chase ran for a special election in Georgia too.
He had run for Congress. He had run for Senate. Chase made a lot of waves when he ran for Senate a couple of years ago and forced a runoff between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker when each of those candidates failed to get the 50% in Georgia because Chase pulled a little bit more than 2%. And so they had to have a runoff.
Yeah. And he ran, of course, on the Libertarian ticket, became a national prominent figure in terms of Libertarian politics. Here he is.
Absolutely.
Presidential candidate. You're the vice president. Can you defend, because I did a little watching of your previous interviews, and I wanted to follow up and get a little bit more knowledge of Mr. Mike Maat. You had said in one of the interviews that the Libertarian Party is the third party. Could you do a little bit more defending on that?
Well, the Libertarian Party is much, much larger than whatever is in fourth place. I didn't mean for that to be a controversial statement. It's just we're nowhere near as large as the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and much larger than what's ever in fourth place. So, in that sense, a lot of people talk about, oh, we wish there was a third party that was, putting up a candidacy. And of course, that's what we have. We have a third party that does that. We have other parties too. And we, of course, have Robert Kennedy's independent candidacy. So folks do have a choice. And I wish very much that folks would avail themselves of these extra choices. I think that people are wasting their votes if they don't vote for the change that they want and if they don't vote for their principles.
Now, I have a little idea that I want to venture later on in the show about sort of coalescing some of these third parties. But before I do, I want to throw it to the topic of...
Well, the problem is that the principles and the policies of the various parties can be substantially different. So, that's kind of hard.
It's just that the idea is that if they somehow did sort of create a faction, it might do something like you saw in France recently, where they're able to put forth a good front against what might be seen as a rising fascist element if various parties coalesce together to stop that. And
yeah, I hear you.
The main idea is busting the duopoly. You're going to need the 3 to 4 to 5 other multiple parties to sort of at least help each other out getting on ballots and stuff like that.
I think that was behind Robert Kennedy's thinking in reaching out to the Libertarian Party, that if, his money and his notoriety had been merged with our administration, our ballot access, our presence in all of the states, that we'd have something that would be really cool. Our delegates weren't as interested as he had hoped that they would be, mostly based on policy principles.
All right. Now, I'm about to throw it to Miss Melissa here in terms of policing. So, Melissa, take it away.
Well, I think actually that's going to be Nakia on policing, but I would love to really quickly just give to ask the question. And it's more so, I want to talk to you about, you are obviously running on Chase Oliver's ticket. And I wanted to know your position on Argentina. He did some acclaim, for lack of a better word, to the Argentinian president. And Milei, I guess is his name.
Yeah.
Yep.
Milei. Yeah. So, this was part of the article. Finally, Oliver said he's enthused by last year's presidential election of the self-described anarcho-capitalist and fellow libertarian Javier Milei in Argentina, and hopes that it is the sign of the rising global appeal of the libertarian ideals and principles. And this is a quote from Oliver. Ultimately, we're going to wear them down and see hopefully the people back at home rising up against socialism as they did in Argentina against Peronism. Oliver said, we now have a libertarian head of state in South America. I hope he's not the last one, and I hope that we can export that and bring that to North America as well. And then further, the article then says, the first thing that Milei did as president was crank out an emergency decree that allowed him to ram through hundreds of dramatic changes without congressional oversight. In just a few months, Milei devalued the Argentinian peso by 54%, removed price controls for food and rent, froze all public works projects, halved the number of federal ministries, slashed government revenue transfers to provinces, cut fuel and transportation subsidies, and laid off 15,000 state workers. Milei claimed a, quote, new era of prosperity. And then last week, when Argentina logged its first quarterly fiscal logged its first quarterly fiscal surplus since 2008, he stabilized the peso's black market exchange rate after months of free fall, and the bond prices climbed. But that's little comfort to poor and middle class Argentines struggling to scrape by as prices rise, wages lose value, and over 40% of Argentines now live below the poverty line, and the community kitchens say they're overwhelmed. That is not an America I want to live in. So can you speak on that?
Sure. Melissa, as you may know, Argentina is the foremost leading example in this hemisphere of an economy that exploded because of socialism. In the 1920s, about 100 years ago, Argentina was the fifth most prosperous nation in the world in terms of per capita income. And it is because it had a relatively free market oriented economy. Since then, it's had one socialist environment imposed by a political regime after another, increasingly peaking with Perón, but certainly maintained since the 1950s by a variety of socialists, interrupted only briefly by certain reform attempts that sort of never really caught a lot of action and didn't last very long. And so Argentina has devolved from one of the wealthiest nations in the world to what I think most people would characterize as a third world country. Technically, we don't really call Argentina a third world country because it used to be so wealthy. But as a practical matter, the standard of living in Argentina is extremely low, and it has been for generations, certainly since the 1960s. It's a real shame. I don't think that it's very likely that the United States, no matter how bad policy gets here over the next couple of decades, I don't think it's very likely the United States is going to descend to the type of, bottom feeding economy that Argentina has. That's the good news. The bad news is that a lot of folks think that the radical changes that people voted for when they voted for Milei, they voted for because things had gotten so bad. Now we see that he has made dramatic changes.
It's not benefiting the poor and middle class.
Oh, it absolutely will. The reason that there's so much poverty, in Argentina, and parenthetically throughout the various nations in Latin America, is because there has been so much socialism that has kept the economies from growing.
The U.S. has played a very, very large role in destabilizing South American and Central American.
Absolutely.
So please do not. I like the socialism.
That is absolutely true.
I hate it when people throw around socialism as much as I hear you throwing around the word socialism. So maybe if you could have a better choice of words, because we don't really have a successful socialist government anywhere in the world. So maybe instead of just throwing out socialism as the fear-mongering tactic that many right-leaning people do, I think we need to talk very honestly about deregulation of how the impacts on the underserved and the marginalized communities. And that's what I want to hear about from you. I used Argentina as an example. What I want you to talk about is this as an example with your policies. When I went to your website, I went to Chase's website. And so this is just a macro view of libertarian policy. And I'm asking you, how do you see that in America with all the deregulation? I saw that it looks like on your platform, you even want to get rid of the Department of Education.
Absolutely. I want to get rid of the Department of Education. The Department of Education at the federal level has really no purpose. that's not a very good example, because a lot of people can disagree about capitalism, socialism, regulation, deregulation, and still agree the Department of Education's got to go.
I don't agree with you at all. I don't agree with you at all. I don't
know.
Look,
the reason education in the United States lags behind other nations, the reason that public sector education so often lags behind private sector alternatives, the reason so many Americans are frustrated with public education in the United States is because there's not enough competition among your choices for how to educate your children. I've spent a lot of time in public school system. I've worked as a substitute teacher. I've raised my kids in public schools and private schools. I've sent my kids to some of the best public schools in the world in Arlington County and some of the worst public schools in the world in Broward County, Florida. So I know where by which I speak.
Of socialism.
What's that?
That happens to be an American version of socialism, though, because we own the land. We own it. We, in terms of the public government, employs the teachers, owns the schools, buys the books. That is a literal version of
Sure, socialism. I wasn't trying to make a case against socialism. I was just Melissa brought up the idea that maybe we need to preserve the Federal Department of Education. Yeah. The reason the Federal Department of Education
for the Federal Department of Education, because what I hear you say is states' rights. And I think everybody on this call right now can agree that states' rights is a real problem, and that we cannot trust the leaders of the individual states to not discriminate and to not basically violate the constitutional rights of the people of this country. And that is that is really the issue. When you talk about deregulating and taking away federal protections, I don't disagree with you, Mike, at all, that we need an overhaul. Like when you look at European countries and their tracks, like their education tracks from, you're starting in 8th grade, once you get into your high school education, the different tracks and paths that they have in Europe. I think we need a complete overhaul with our U.S. education. But the problem with that is that it's the defunding of public education systematically since integration, because of the foundational issue in America is racism. And so when you have systematically defunded schools, and the states also under Republican control, they're like, eat it up, defund it all. Let's put that money into the policing. Let's put that money into other areas, into private market. Now we have problems in education, and no one wants to talk, including president and vice presidential candidates, about what has been done to the public education system in this country since the 1950s.
Well, the public education system in the United States since the 1950s has stunk. And the truth is that it hasn't been defunded. The amount of money that we spend per child in public schools is higher than it's ever been. Melissa, I'm not going to argue with you about facts. You can look it up later. The amount of money that we spend per pupil in public schools is not only higher than it's ever been, but it's higher even relative to inflation than it's ever been. The problem is that only wealthy Melissa, go look it up. Don't shake your head when an economist tells you about the money that's spent on public schools. It's the truth. Now, we can argue that it's not spent very well. We can argue that they don't do a good job. I would agree with you. But the truth of the matter is that we spend an enormous amount of money educating our kids in the United States. We just don't get a very good bang for our buck. And in my view, a huge problem is that it's only the wealthy families that are able to escape the public school system. And I wish, look, I spent a lot of time in Broward County, where the poorest families, largely families of color, but not exclusively. There's a lot of poor white families in Broward County and in the contiguous counties. These are families that have no choices available to them. And I just think it's absolutely wrong that these families are trapped in crappy public school systems. And the federal government doesn't help the situation. The federal government takes money away from localities through taxes, and it gives it back in block grants with rules attached. Now, you may like the rules. maybe even some of the roles I would like. But there's no economic reason, there's no educational reason, there's no competitive reason. There's no logical reason why local school districts can't make up their own minds regarding how to educate their kids. So you don't need a federal government to do that.
Can I dip in here?
Yeah.
Okay. Because like the question that I was initially gonna ask, we've literally gone like from A to E to J with kind of the topics that we've talked about. But I'd love to jump in on education.
Go ahead.
Because I happen to be extremely passionate about education for a variety of different reasons.
You ran for school board.
What I did. But what my question is with the position to abolish the Department of Education, what are your thoughts of the way that you and your running mate would protect the interests of underserved children, i.e., children who are in Title I areas, and then kids who are affected by insane state level policies that are only regulated by the federal government involvement via the Office of Civil Rights and so forth.
I don't think, as a practical matter, just by the way, I don't think it's really true that the federal government does a very good job of protecting minority kids or kids at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. I just don't think as a factual matter that that's true. I wish it were, don't get me wrong. I don't, as a libertarian, I don't expect much from the federal government. The one thing I do want from the federal government, well, I guess there's two things. One is to make us safe, but the other is to protect our civil liberties, especially against government agencies. So I wish what you were saying were more true than I personally believe that it is, but that's a separate matter. I think that the big role that the federal Department of Education plays in America is not trying to protect fairness or the civil liberties of kids in certain states. The big role that it plays is unifying a set of rules by which kids are educated. That's not necessarily per se a bad thing, except that I think it's done a crappy job of it. And I just don't think that there's an educational justification for standardization, and to reallocate money. If you're interested in using the reallocation of money in order to advance the educational opportunities of kids that have up until now not had very good opportunities, then you need a good, robust school choice program. You need for money to be available so that it's not just wealthy kids that can go to private school, but it's poor kids. The reason that there is no private school in the west side of Broward County is because you don't have a school choice program. But trust me, if you were to open up competition, the Archdiocese of Miami would make darn sure that they were in on it for their bite of the apple. It's just how, greed works and how expansion works. And, I don't want to accuse the Archdiocese of Miami of being greedy. I mean, I think that they really do want to provide a good bang for the buck and a good service. I would say the same thing about the other private schools in Florida. Florida is my favorite example because the public schools are so bad, and the private schools therefore do play a major role for the wealthy families, in contrast, for example, with the suburbs of Washington, D.C., where the public schools are so good and the private schools don't need to play such a robust role. But that's how to create opportunity, is to create more competition that families can afford, not just wealthy families.
So I want to piggyback off of what you just said. And part of that is I want to provide you a small amount of context, on where this question is coming from. I'm in debt over having to pull my child out of public education and place her in private schools. And, due to safety concerns.
Through the what?
Safety.
Due to safety concerns. Due to safety concerns.
Oh, safety concerns.
Safety.
I get it. Sure. Absolutely.
And, you look at the we'll just speak on, where, most of us are here from, which, of course, is the Commonwealth of Virginia. When you look at as you stated, when you look at the quality of education in Northern Virginia, that is very different than what you'll see in rural Virginia or what you'll see in Richmond and in areas that aren't Chesapeake and Virginia Beach.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So in that, when you have not only, students who need to be well served, but you also have a population of teachers who also need to be protected, as well as, supported in their choice to be of public service and education. What do you see that looking like as a real rubric for the Libertarian Party with education? Because, school choice is a great conversation to have when it's, kind of, I don't know, when it's in a perfect world type thing, and this isn't a perfect world. And you have not only the school choice side where public education is defunded, but what happens to those neighborhoods with parents who don't have the ability or the opportunity to understand the school choice system, as well as implement those choices going forward. And then alongside that, when you have school choice and these schools are funneling from all types of environments and neighborhoods, similar to busing, how do you make sure that doesn't become a situation where people tag in these school choice options, but for those who don't have access to the schools that they want to send their children to, they're left in the lurch with underperforming schools that are now, not funded because of school choice in itself.
Well, you said a lot there, and in my view, the implication of your questions is exactly 100% correct in every case. And maybe I'm assuming a little bit about the implication of your questions, but where do we start? I think school choice is a good conversation to have, not just in a perfect world, but in the crummy world that we have now. I'm less worried, as I said, about Arlington County. If they don't have a robust school choice program, that might bother me, but it's not nearly as critical as it is in the places, Richmond, you put your finger on. And there's plenty of places around the United States that you and I are perfectly deadly aware of that are places where they are in critical need of fundamental reform. By the way, good for you for, I'm sorry you had to go into debt. Good for you for making that. Believe me, I know it's a tough choice. I wish I had no idea what you were talking about. I pulled my kids out of Broward Public Schools to go to the local Catholic schools. I'm a Lutheran, but we get along when we have to, right? When your kids are at stake. And it wasn't easy. Financially, it wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. I know you didn't ask me for advice, but I personally think you're doing the right thing. So good luck with that. But in these places,
due to the debt, I now homeschool my daughter. So
well, good for you. I never went that far, but I know a lot of people who have. Good for you, because by and large, everyone tells me it's the best decision they ever made. I'm waiting for someone to finally tell me that they regretted that decision, but I haven't heard a single parent tell me that. So good for you. It is in these critically underserved areas that school choice is so important. What we're talking about is greater service. We're not talking about less funding. On a per pupil basis, we're typically talking about increasing funding in the public schools, because to the extent to which you don't pull out, this is just arithmetic, I'm not expressing an opinion, to the extent to which you don't pull out 100% of the funding per pupil to go to the private school, you're leaving in, a few extra pennies despite a particular child leaving. So the amount of money per kid, per student, per pupil left in the public schools would increase. Yes, Melissa.
I just want to make it clear with when you have school choice, the largest population of people that are affected, children, are the disabled. When you take all regulations away from schools and then you're giving taxpayer money to private entities who do not have to abide by any regulations, they choose the students that they want to come in. And the people that are most effective at the top of the list are the disabled students. And then the next are the Black and brown students. And that is statistically the truth.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And
so in my opinion, you're putting money and I guess I just don't understand. If you understand that, why would you, if you understand that, then why would you support deregulating Department of Education? Why would you support school choice and vouchers to go to private entities where you know that they can deny based on disabilities or race?
Because the amount of funding available to the kids that remain in the public schools on a per pupil basis would go up. The reason the private...
You literally said pennies.
Again, I'm not expressing an opinion. I'm just doing the math. That's just arithmetic. If you take out 85 cents on the dollar every time a kid switches from a public school to a private school, 15 cents left in, the amount of money per pupil left in the public schools is going to go up. You are right that
but what you're missing are the state legislators in every individual state. What happens is when enrollment in public schools is down, funding decreases. And it may not be funding per pupil. It may be in other areas, like Virginia Beach has schools where our roofs are leaking on our children. And we don't have in our CIP, they're trying to find the money for that because they don't, because of economic issues, things like that, they're trying to find money
as well.
And so,
yes, of course, exactly. That's why we need
What did she say?
I said Hampton as well.
Yeah, Hampton as well. Gotcha.
Newport News, Hampton, Norfolk.
I mean, it's all of our public schools.
All over. They're all over.
Yes, the public schools struggle with money. Let's stipulate that. There's no question about it. The reason the education is not good is because there are no competitive forces. There is no choice. There are no options for parents. They are trapped in crappy schools. That's the truth.
The crappy schools is
choice program. You would be able to pull out
cart before the horse. It just doesn't make any sense to me that the platform that you have with this.
Let me explain it and then criticize it. Don't criticize it first.
It's all economics. It's all economics for you.
Before you guys both do that, I want to.
No, it's not. It's economics for you. You're arguing that okay. You're arguing that because there would be less money in the public school system, even though it would be more money per pupil, would be per se a bad thing. And I'm just suggesting that if you drive up the amount of money per pupil in the public schools and simultaneously give families a choice where they can opt into a local private school, they would have an ability to get a school that better aligns with their interests and values and educational goals. Yes, the private schools do typically, not uniformly, but
White,
typically,
able-bodied.
you're right, they only choose.
Able-bodied. That's it. They take the
That's
white.
what I was about. Melissa, you should really wait until I finish my sentences, because you should let me agree with you.
But you
interrupt
know this,
me
and
as
you
though
still
you want me
believe
to
that.
disagree with you, but I'm agreeing with you. The private schools would choose the cheapest kids. Absolutely. And we see as a practical matter that they do that. If you spin off 80 cents on the dollar, 85 cents on the dollar, 70 cents on the dollar, it would give families that are not wealthy an opportunity to avail themselves of a different choice that would better align with their objectives. And because you don't spin off 100 cents on the dollar, you would have the opportunity to increase per pupil funding in the public schools. You are right that public schools are where most of the kids with disabilities would continue to go to school. And I think that you would agree. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you would agree that that is not an inappropriate role for public schools, that private schools are probably not best set. Maybe in time, maybe someday, you know, as an economist, I hope that private schools will eventually compete to provide services for special needs kids.
Private
and I think the distant future, they
originated.
probably would, but today they haven't.
Private schools originated out of elitism, white patriarchal policy, and then out of segregation and then integration. So private schools, in my opinion,
And we want to overcome that. You don't want to just leave that as
private
the
schools should exist, but citizens' tax dollars, the wealthy people that want to send their children, and my children went to private school for a few years. My children had a public education and a private education. So I'm not,
all of ours did. I'm saying that we want families that cannot today afford them have that choice. It's not, in my view, now I am expressing an opinion.
So,
it's not right that these choices are only available to wealthy families and that poor families are trapped in crappy public schools. That bothers me. I think it should bother all of us.
So I have a question.
Several.
With school choice, how, if a universal school choice program was implemented in this country, how would you battle public dollars going to parochial schools?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but I think you mean, I don't, what you mean by battle. That's what we want.
Well, but that's the thing. Like, okay. And I guess I'm trying to clarify my answer my question, because when you look at, and this is something that I actually had to deal with my situation with my daughter. When it's a private college prep school, the question about faith-based education is not involved. But when you start talking about Catholic schools, when you start talking about Christian-based schools, anything that has a faith-based component in regards to the education that they provide, you then run into issues where, now you're funding church-based programs.
That's right. And I don't think, let me jump in.
Okay.
I think it is wrong, unethical, and unconstitutional for the government to be discriminating against types of schools. When the government raises money to educate kids, and we can argue about whether that's a good idea or not, but today let's accept that as a given. The government raises money largely through property taxes, right? Local governments.
Right.
They raise money to educate kids in primary and secondary educational schooling. That's just how the system works. The next question is, why, I ask rhetorically, there's no good educational reason, why would you decide to spend that money only in programs in which public sector employees work? For example, let me give you another example. Local governments raise money to pick up the garbage. Not a very elegant example. They raise money to employ police officers, right? In those cases, a police officer is a little bit more complicated. We can set that aside. But for, picking up the garbage, you would immediately say it's silly to say that the local government would not be allowed to contract out that service, that it could only be done by public sector employees. That would be silly. We would all reject that out of hand. I would argue the same thing for police officers. There's no inherent reason why your police department has to be public sector employees, why that can't be contracted to a firm that went through the same training, the same everything. There's no inherent reason why those should be public sector employees. There is no inherent reason. There's no economic reason. There's no educational reason why the government should make the decision that all of the money is going to go to its own public sector organization, and you're not going to be allowed to have access to that money to make any choices yourself. If this were any other business, right? If this were not schools, you would reject it out of hand. You would say that's insane, right? But we have grown accustomed to this structure of the industry over 100 years, of course. And now it feels awkward. It feels strange. It feels risky. And in some cases it is, I suppose. Change always brings risk, especially in the short run. But it feels uncomfortable to talk about changing it back to a more logical system where the government raises the money and then allows you to pick. Do you want to go to the public school? Do you want to go to a different school? The government should have no business asking you or imposing on you a rule that says, oh, well, you can't go to private school A because, that's run by Catholics, and you can't go to private school B because it's run by, the local synagogue, or, I don't want the government asking such silly rules. If we can demonstrate that we're checking the right boxes in terms of using the money for educating our kids, I think that parents ought to be the ones to make those decisions. Don't you? I said something that's weird?
Well, here's the thing, and I guess I just kind of want to piggyback off of your example. The portion of my tax dollars that go towards, policing in my area, right? I don't have a choice on where that money goes. Like, I can't sit there and say, the Hampton Police Department sucks, so I want my money to go towards Newport News.
No, but the city should have a choice. Your city should have an opportunity to say, you know what? Our police department sucks. By the way, I don't know that it does. I don't mean to make it personal.
Do you mean
that's something I'm not going to comment on because this will take way too long.
Well, okay, but I just meant I don't mean to comment on your particular police department. I don't know whether they're terrific or awful. But your city should have the right to say, as my employer did say from time to time, we can fire all you guys and hire the sheriff's office. Now, that's only two choices. At least the town that I worked for as a cop had two choices. Most places don't even have two choices. They've only got one choice. That's a sheriff's office, love it or shove it. But you want your city to have as many choices as possible. They should have a choice between the sheriff's office and having their own local police department, but they should also have the choice of hiring another firm, on a 3-year contract or a longer term contract or a shorter term contract to provide those services. And if they don't do a good job, you can fire them and hire somebody else. You want your town to have as many choices as possible. Now, you're right. In the case of policing, it doesn't make sense on a family by family by family basis having the choice, because police work is something that is inherently geographic. So is picking up the garbage. It's inherently geographic. There's efficiencies. If you're picking up your neighbor's garbage, picking up the next neighbor's garbage is a lot cheaper. But you want your town to have all these choices. In the cases of schools, your town should be able to make these choices available to you. There's no reason why you should be limited to one choice.
Are you advocating for private policing?
I am advocating that your town should have the right to choose a private sector organization if they want to.
Sounds like
there's no inherent reason why it should be illegal.
Well, I mean, why can the police department just not hire the people and hire good people and train good people? Like, why private sector? I mean, are you familiar with what happened to Sonia Massey? And that was police. I mean,
Melissa, I was a police officer for 11 and a half years. I'm intimately familiar with police work.
Okay, well, my father was also a police officer, so it's not. I mean, it doesn't matter. You went to work for the police department. But why would you say that you would advocate for private policing when police officers shoot and kill innocent civilians on the regular?
That's why. I'm advocating that your town should have more choices. You're advocating that your town should be stuck with one choice.
So I'd like to talk about policing. How do you feel your experience in Broward County has shaped your policy positions on criminal justice?
Well, in a number of ways, of course. First of all, I should say that I was lucky. The department that I went to work for was a very good police department. That's just objectively speaking. I got lucky. By comparison to agencies nearby, we were in good shape, especially for the second half of the period that I spent there. My understanding is the department had some troubles in the immediate years preceding me getting there, but I had a good experience. I was very lucky. I was also able to find a police department that did have a separate vice unit and a separate traffic unit. So I didn't have to get involved with the stuff that I personally consider dopey, like, the war on drugs and prostitution stings and traffic ticket quotas to raise money for the town or something like that. I was able to avoid the stuff that I personally don't like as a libertarian. So I had a good experience. But you are able to see the difference between what is, in my opinion, good police work and bad police work. You learn pretty quick that as a police officer, you're the first and last defense of the Constitution. And that is fundamentally the difference between good police work and bad police work. You're able to compare how you do business to the agencies with whom you work from time to time that are geographically contiguous, geographically proximate. You get to know, how certain police officers work and others don't. So you see the differences. In my view, we need to make police work more like other businesses that work better. I don't think it's any coincidence that two of the industries in the United States with whom we are most frustrated are teaching, schools and policing. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that these are areas where we need a good, strong dose of reality. And what I mean by that is we want them to be more like other industries. We want the best teachers and police officers to get paid more and the weaker ones to get paid less. And we want the crappy ones to be fired. And we want bad behavior to see some accountability. I'm not suggesting that anyone doesn't have a First Amendment right to form a union, but the unions have walked all over our local politicians. I wish that weren't the case, but local politicians don't do a very good job of negotiating contracts to hold people accountable. And so in the case of police work, I think a big first step toward that is to get rid of qualified immunity, the federal doctrine, and replace it with requirements for police officers to carry their own liability insurance, which would put some skin in the game. And just as importantly, would create an environment in which a third party, an outside private sector check on the system from the insurance company, would demand, would negotiate for some extra transparency and accountability. I think that would be a good thing.
I actually agree with you on that.
And I also need to think that we need to figure out ways to make sure Sean Graysons don't get hired across multiple municipalities, because he had a record prior to going to Sonia Massey's door.
I would like to say this is probably the very first thing that I actually agree with Mike on.
Right.
I don't think that's true, Melissa. I think you agree with me.
I 100% do.
First,
I don't think that's true, though. I think you agree with me in most of what we've been talking about. I think that there are just certain points that you disagree with.
There are definitely the majority of your points. Yes, I do. But that's okay. I'm here to learn, and different perspectives. I'm here
what
to
about
learn.
world policing and the chance of Mike Termat and Chase Oliver Ticket being the lead of the country that is the most influential at messing with others, if that makes sense. So how do we tamp down?
Look, I personally feel like our foreign policy sucks, and I believe that for two very, very, very different reasons. Number one, I think that our foreign policy, it's what I would characterize as its military interventionism, right? The projection of hegemonic power for the sake of control, for the sake of dictating to others how to behave. I think our foreign policy does not align with American principles, American values, with American ethics. I think it does not reflect who we are as a people. And so I've got a big problem with it from that regard. The second reason I think our foreign policy sucks is that as a practical matter, setting ethics aside, it's a failure. It doesn't work. It doesn't achieve things that are in our strategic interests. It doesn't make us safer. It doesn't lower the cost of doing business. It doesn't open up, new markets for us from whom to buy or to whom to sell. It doesn't make things cheaper. It makes things more expensive, more dangerous. And all you need to do is ask any American, right? Drop a Frisbee out of the 10th story window of a building downtown. First person that picks it up, you ask them, go ahead and list all the military interventions that you think have been a good idea since World War II, that even though it cost us billions of dollars, even though it cost us thousands of lives, it was a good idea anyway. Go ahead.
That's sort of what my follow-up was going to be, was that World War II is what's considered like our best version of trying to do foreign policy, even though in the 30s it was a bad version of doing foreign policy because we didn't interact in order to stop the rise of the thing that caused World War II in the first place. Then we do Lend-Leasing, Marshall Plans, things like that. And now we have situations like we're spending so many tens of billions of dollars in Ukraine and Israel simultaneously. And it's like we're taking two sides of a coin that the libertarian perspective might be seen as an absolutist, to not support either side of an aggressor and a defender.
Well, I'll leave the semantics to you. There are a lot of people who would argue with you about your characterization of Ukraine and Israel, but set that aside. What's that?
That's why I chose the two examples, though.
Well, good for you, but I don't think the semantics add anything to the discussion. The practical truth is that foreign aid around the world does not buy the American government influence. We used to think that it would, or that it should, or that it did, none of which is true. And this isn't really a matter of conjecture or opinion. Look, the White House says so, right? The White House has expressed its frustration with its inability to influence or affect the way the Israeli government has made decisions in terms of how to prosecute the war in Gaza. the President of the United States was turned down for a meeting with the King of Jordan. That's a weird thing. We have given many, many billions of dollars to the government of Israel on an annual basis, and many billions of dollars collectively on an annual basis to the other players that are immediately contiguous to Israel. Consider that we have given a tremendous amount of money to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the Palestinian Authority, to the government of Lebanon, the government of Egypt, the Kingdom of Jordan, all of these players. And we have absolutely no influence over any of them. The truth is that foreign aid just doesn't work. And by the way, as an ethical proposition, I've got a problem with taking money away from Americans forcibly. This is not optional, right? Including families who are among whom are the least able to afford it. Taking money away from American families and using it to conduct proxy wars, to try to buy influence with governments around the world, to exert our own influence. I think that that's an ethical problem. I don't think these are decisions that would be made by the typical American.
I have a question that kind of ties into something that you said a little bit earlier. You support ending qualified immunity for law enforcement, but
or other public officials, sure.
I guess where my question is where would the elimination of qualified immunity stop? I.e., I think that if local governments are negligent, that qualified immunity should be eliminated as well. I think that if school systems are negligent, qualified immunity shouldn't apply. But when you open up that rabbit hole, because I mean, you know, my opinion is it should go away, period. But, you know, then the issue becomes judicial. And where is the line drawn to where qualified immunity should be allowed and where it shouldn't?
Well, the entirety, I agree with, I think where you're going, the entirety of the idea of qualified immunity needs to go. And that's for a couple of different reasons. One is, you know, this idea that people won't be held accountable, I think is really dopey. But it also, it precludes more effective ways to hold people accountable, I guess, is another way of saying that. But the other side of the coin, and I think this goes to more to your point, the idea that American citizens should not be allowed to seek redress in court, that's a weird thing. I would argue that that's fairly fundamentally un-American, right? We recognize that our courts are not perfect, but we want our courts to play the role that they're supposed to play. If you've got a case, look, you might have a crappy case, I don't know, but you ought to have the right to bring your case to court and seek redress if you believe that you have been wronged by a government, by a government agency, by a government agent. You should have the right to seek redress. And the doctrine of qualified immunity throws a roadblock in that I think is wholly inappropriate. As far as other agencies or types of agencies, yes, if you believe that you have an actionable complaint, you should be able to seek accountability in court. I make no reference to whether or not you have a good case. That's not the point. The point is that you should be able to avail yourselves of the opportunities that our court system are supposed to provide.
Well, on the topic of the court system, we have 13 federal districts and we have 9 Supreme Court justices. What says you about expanding the court to 13?
I don't think it changes anything. If 9 doesn't strike me as necessarily a perfect number, neither does 13, neither does 7 or 5.
Well, but the facts are we have 13 federal districts.
Yeah.
Shouldn't we have a member of the Supreme Court representing all of them individually?
There is some logic there, but I don't think that there's an inherent flaw by missing that opportunity. There's nothing magical about 9 or 13. One might argue maybe we should only have 9 federal districts so that they align with the 9 justices. I don't think there's anything magical about a particular number. As you know, Melissa, most people, not you, I'm not suggesting, but most people who make the argument that the Supreme Court should be expanded or effectively shrunk by term limits, they're making the argument not mostly on principle, but mostly, or even efficiency or effectiveness or democratic principles, but mostly because they're frustrated with the court at the moment, right? At the moment, the court is fairly conservatives and a lot of
fairly. Did you just say fairly?
Largely.
Fairly? Not at all.
Well, Melissa, look,
that's millions of women in this country right now.
Melissa, you have a certain set of opinions. Good for you. I'm trying to agree with you that most people consider the court to be conservative at the moment. Yep. And so most of the people who want to expand the court are liberal because they want to wash out the effectiveness of the current justices. When the court is viewed as fairly liberal, the conservatives get frustrated and they want to expand the court to wash out the effectiveness of the currently seated justices. So as a matter of, what's that?
No, I was saying, go ahead. I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's just, that's just the way of it. I don't see any particular magic about a particular number of justices. I think 7 and 5 strike me as a little bit small. I don't have a problem with 11 or 13, but I do have a problem with a lot of folks' motivations that they just don't like the kind of decisions coming out of the Supreme Court lately.
So do you agree with the implementation of term limits and a ethics
definitely the ethics
rules on SCOTUS?
Sure. I think that that's probably a good idea. I think most Americans were a little bit surprised that, we didn't have, I say we, that the Supreme Court had not imposed on itself or that Congress had not imposed on it a set of ethical standards. And there is a fig leaf of a little bit of an ethical guidance for the Supreme Court, but I think most of us were surprised that it's as lucid as it is. I don't have a problem with tightening that up. I think that that's a good idea. Term limits is one of those things that has caused libertarians with a lowercase l, I mean, all the way back to the founders, right? Some consternation. Fundamentally, the idea of protecting your civil liberties means you ought to have the right to vote for whatever nincompoop you want to vote for. And if you want to vote for the same jerk 30 times in a row, knock yourself out, right? Unfortunately, we have discovered over the past 240 years that incumbency is per se something that undermines the democratic institution of electability and fair elections and democratic representation. That is something I don't think that the framers had fully anticipated. I don't mean to say that they were stupid. I think it's hard to imagine in 1789 how corrupt politicians are going to eventually become by the 21st century. And so from a strictly libertarian point of view, we recoil at the idea of term limits because, like I say, voters should be able to vote for whomever they want. But I would say that term limits are one of those things that we used to think of as a bad idea, but a bad idea whose time has come. I think that we have to recognize that incumbency has been abused by politicians, and that we should be limiting the amount of time that people are allowed to spend in Congress, in the Senate. Individual states can make up their own mind about their legislatures. Regarding the Supreme Court, sure. I don't have a problem with term limits. I don't necessarily think that that's a silver bullet. I don't think that that's going to solve all of our problems. We haven't had a giant problem in the Supreme Court with people being too old. We've had a little bit of problem with that, but people have retired. I think that one of the problems in the Supreme Court regarding retirement is that people manipulate their own retirement, right? They want to retire while a president is in power that agrees with their way of thinking. And that's kind of a weird thing. And so for that reason alone, I think a term limit on SCOTUS is probably a good idea.
I'm curious if the idea of prolonged time serving in a position is more corruptive than the idea of money flowing to you would be corruptive. And by that, I mean money in politics. Is it better to go after money in politics or term limits?
They do tend to go hand in hand. People who have been in office for a long, long time have more predictable voting records, and therefore they get more money from lobbyists. That's a weird phenomenon that on some level I wish I didn't know that that's true, but it is true. So they're not completely disentangled. The money thing is worrisome. It's problematic, and it's very difficult to figure out what to do about it, because people do, have the right to spend their money the way that they want to. I'm a big believer in greater transparency. That is not a silver bullet, as we have seen, but I'm a little bit leery of a law that would limit the extent to which some rich fool would be able to spend his money. That rich fool is going to be able to find a way through it, number one. And number two, I think that we need to all be a little bit careful about making rules for how other people behave.
Yeah,
Don't get me wrong. I'm not.
Those people are buying our politicians, though. Like, they're literally, these rich, dopey people are buying our government.
The PACs have enormous influence.
Reform desperately in this country. Desperately.
Well, we've been through it. It wasn't a silver bullet. I'm open to ideas. I'd even be open to discussing it directly with you. But the truth of the matter is that we have gone through periods where we had much tighter rules, and it didn't really change much. That's not a powerful argument against it. But as a practical matter, it's not easy. And as I say, as a First Amendment issue, there are some real ethical considerations.
Now, we're nearing a time that's a little long in this show. So I know I had so many questions that I still wanted to ask, just because I love talking about politics. And if I'm pretty sure my friends here also have follow-ups themselves, but I don't want to drag us out too long here. So I would love to have you on again in the future, so we could actually have these.
Sure, absolutely. But go ahead, ask another question. I've got a couple minutes more.
If you're willing, that's fine. I got one that's because I'm in Portsmouth, and we recently had a lot of flooding issues. Virginia Beach has long had flooding issues. We're building wind farms off our coast with Dominion Power, all because we have this prolonged want to fight on climate change, which we never thought, us being progressives, that we would have libertarians on our side on this. If you and Chase become the leaders of the executive branch of the United States, how would you want to address that?
We're big believers that decisions need to be made as locally as possible. I just don't think the federal government is an organization that you want to be making decisions about how to reallocate money around the United States. I think it's fundamentally a bad idea. I think it's corrupting. I think it's inefficient, ineffective, and will wind up in stupid solutions. And I have 200 years of history to back me up on that. Having said that, if your local municipality believes that it has to take matters into its own hands, then you've got to be able to convince your local constituents. I don't mean to sound pessimistic. I know my tone sounds a little pessimistic, but you need to be able to convince your local constituents that we have a problem. It's going to require some extra resources. There's going to have to be a public finance role in providing some solutions. And I would be optimistic that you would be able to carry the day. Having said that, I think as a matter of reality and a matter of economics, I don't know that I've ever said the following out loud in a public forum before, but it needs to be said. There are some communities that I can't predict the future about climate change, right? None of us can. I don't know the extent to which water level is going to rise or temperatures are going to change. I don't know the answer. But never mind all that. I make no pretense that I have a scientific solution here, or I should say scientific outlook that should carry the argument or carry the day. My point is that if we find ourselves facing serious costs of an order of magnitude that a particular local community cannot handle, that still does not imply that it's a national, federal issue. There will be communities, and trust me, this saddens me to say it, there will be local communities, potentially, depending on the effects of climate change, that have to go through serious depopulation. That's a very, very sad thing. But protectionism in business, in economics, in markets, we have learned the hard way, right? Look at Detroit. Doesn't work. It leads to catastrophic disaster in the long run. And I believe that the same thing will be true for climate change. We need to be prepared to make serious decisions, serious changes, and allow those changes to take place over time and not put our head in the sand and pretend that, you know, we're going to get a certain amount of money from the federal government and fix this problem. It doesn't work like that.
So my question on that is, and this, largely comes because of the area, that we live in. Climate change is now causing an issue with our military forces because we have military bases that, are floating in a nor'easter almost. So what would be your solution if the deregulation of climate policy affects our national defense?
You got a couple of different questions there that need to be disentangled. Possibly even more importantly, our national defense needs to be fairly fundamentally reconfigured. For example, and nobody in Portsmouth wants to hear this, nobody in Norfolk wants to hear this, but the projection of military power through aircraft carriers is a dinosaur. This is not something that you're going to want to spend money on in the middle of the 21st century. We're going to have to move away from that type of military projection anyway. And so the idea that naval bases are becoming extraordinarily expensive should only accelerate that. It's not the kind of thing at which we should be throwing an extra $1 trillion to pretend like it's not true. I hope that makes some sense. I'm not a big fan of looking at reality and saying, oh, never mind, we'll just spend more money.
All right. Well, Ms. Melissa, would you like to follow up with either a question on climate change or perhaps another topic before we peter on out of here?
Absolutely. One more question. Go for it.
All right. Let's talk about gun control. What is your position on gun control and an assault weapons ban?
It doesn't work.
It did from 1994 to 2004.
It didn't.
Yes, it did. The statistics will tell you. The numbers tell you. Yes, it did.
You're going to have to show me that.
I would love to.
Yeah.
Very
Email
easily.
me.
It's very easily accessible. Good. What's your email?
Mike@MikeTremont.com.
And the fact that you do not know that is interesting.
I've looked at Melissa. Let's be kind. I'm being kind with you. I'm
not being mean. You haven't seen Mean Friend.
All right. Well, good for you, Melissa. You're good at projecting bullying. I'm proud of you.
I am. I'm
Look,
really good.
I have, whenever you're ready.
I don't find anything else you probably have to say on this matter. So go ahead. You can move to another question.
Well,
no, I mean, this is your question, not mine. The truth of the matter is that gun control doesn't address our most fundamental problems with what we view as gun violence in the United States, which is a huge problem. It has been demonstrated not to be effective in the past, but I also believe that the hurdle that it would have to clear is enormously high. Before you start compromising Americans' rights, you better have an awfully powerful case, and that case hasn't been made. It is true that we have a violence problem in the United States. It is huge. No question about that. The vast majority of gun deaths in the United States revolve around either suicide or drug transactions and drug competitiveness and gang competitiveness that comes from drugs. That doesn't make it unimportant. I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting is that the solutions to those problems are not per se gun related. We have psychological problems in the United States as a society, increasingly growing, more frustrating, more dangerous than ever before, and we need to figure out solutions. No one should be trying to run away from that. I'm not suggesting that you are. You're not trying to run away from that. You're trying to meet it head on. Me too. I think we probably disagree on how to do that. With regard to the war on drugs from our government, I believe it is handled completely incorrectly. As a police officer, I have seen things that have convinced me that criminalizing the use of drugs in the United States is a losing proposition. It does not work in terms of making your community safer. It makes your community less safe. It does not work in terms of keeping kids or adults off of drugs. It does not save lives from overdoses. And I speak as someone who's performed CPR on a dozen people in my lifetime. It is a horrible situation that we're in. I wish that we could just criminalize something and save tens of thousands of lives, but that's not the case. I firmly believe that we need to decriminalize all drugs, by the way. I think that needs to begin with completing the decriminalization of marijuana. It needs to move next and quickly to other drugs that are not addictive, because I think that the American electorate will be more open to that idea. And I think that over time, and I'm hoping that that's relatively swift, Americans will get comfortable with the idea of decriminalizing drugs that are addictive. And this will reduce the number of people that we incarcerate. I believe that it will diminish the number of deaths that we have that come largely because of fraud and misunderstanding and misuse and accidents. I also believe it will lead to more people seeking help for their addiction problems. This is obviously a huge problem in the United States and deserves more time and frankly more expertise. But I'm glad that we're at least starting to address it.
Well, I will admit, while I might not agree on your stance on gun control, I do agree on your stance on the war on drugs. And going into the fact that you came on this show and you have addressed three progressives, I respected you came here to at least engage us with that.
You sound like the progressives are somehow bad or naughty.
I never said that we
feel
were
differently. I think we feel the same. we have
For
maybe
instance, the
different
war on
angles
drugs.
on what we would do about problems, but I mean, you're going to think this is a throwaway line. Honestly, you are each and all perfectly wonderful, and I have completely enjoyed my time with you. And I have no doubt that if we had more time together, instead of just focusing on arguing about public policy, we would see the world so similarly that, you know, we would more enjoy our time together. But no, I'm sorry if I made you feel like it was a frustrating experience.
Well, frustrating because we are all passionate about this. We're coming at this from different angles. But the fact that you came on and wanted to, you stayed with us the whole time. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. And I'm
do
grateful
too.
that you would choose to have me on. And maybe we can do it again in the future. I would welcome
We
that.
had a lot of other topics that we wrote down that we're thinking about talking
I'm
about.
sure.
But
But
I
for
want
the
to do,
record, really quick, Conrad, I do want to say I also agree with completely legalizing all recreational drugs. I think the war on drugs was absolutely horseshit. So, see, we found something else that we could find on common ground on.
what I would like to do is, Mr. Mike Termat, you have the floor to just give your elevator pitch.
Well, I suppose if anyone's lasted this long, they know how I feel about most things. I'm skeptical about government solutions. And I've been in and around government long enough to know whereby which I speak. Look, a lot of people grew up Republicans, as I did. I started out as a Republican in financial services, working with, a lot of businesses and industries. I joined the Republican Party feeling like it would represent my interests in fiscal conservatism, free markets, free trade, pro-growth economics. Boy, the Republican Party and people who feel like I do have really gone in two different directions. That is no longer a party that represents those interests. And I would say the same thing about the Democratic Party. Most of my family are Democrats, you know, having joined the party, believing that party would stand up for your First Amendment rights, for example, against government censorship. No longer the case. That's a party that would stand up for peace over war. Wow. You know, my family and the Democratic Party have really gone in two different directions. And so there's a lot of frustration out there with the legacy parties, the big parties, the old-fashioned parties, what we in the Libertarian Party call the duopoly parties, right? And I think that we need to recognize that it's the parties that have left you. I would encourage you to continue to fight for your principles and to vote for your principles. If you still believe in those, you're going to find that you're very comfortable inside the Libertarian Party that probably hasn't changed very much over the years. We still stand up for your right to live your life by your own standard, that you should be living your life the way that you want to, that you should not have to worry about the government telling you how they're going to censor your social media, the government telling you have to have a vaccine or that you have to shut down your business because of an epidemic. These are decisions that you should be able to make as a grown-ass adult. And I would say the same thing about, how you run your business and how you educate your kids. These are decisions that you should be making for yourself. So I encourage you to check out the Libertarian Party and don't waste your vote. Vote for the change that you want. Vote for your principles. If you do like the direction the Republican Party is going as a matter of principle, then vote for them. And if you do like the direction the Democratic Party is going as a matter of principle, then vote for them. But don't do it because you hate the other side, or don't do it because, you just don't know what else to do. Vote for your principles and vote for the change that you want in the long run.
Well, this has been SchezzWho. And I want to thank my good friend, Nakia Miller, and Miss Melissa Lucasen, great friend as well, coming on to want to engage a national politician. And Mr. Mike Termat, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. I look forward to being with you again.
Thank you so much for that. And yes, I would love to have a continued conversation. I hope everyone has a great night tonight. Thank you for watching SchezzWho, and like and subscribe and all that wonderfulness.